I'm hoping this works this time, because the last time it crashed out a couple of minutes in. So, first one today, the easiest one for me to do, Elgin Cathedral. So Elgin Cathedral started in 1224. They took over a smaller church and converted it into the cathedral. There are various markings all the way around on the inside and outside of the building where they would have the bishop bless the building so that it could become the cathedral. But that's a bit for a later lesson. For today, we're just going to do basic overview of the cathedral's history and its place in Elgin. So, 1224 we started. There have been 3 fires at Elgin Cathedral. The first one was in 1270, which was ruled as an accident. Now, what allegedly happened there is the bishop was doing paperwork by candlelight, fell asleep, knocked the candle over, and the cathedral went up in flames. Now, the backstory before this fire, the bishop had written to the Pope and asked for more money to be sent to the cathedral so they could extend the cathedral, because at that point it was the biggest and the only cathedral this far north. Inverness one hadn't been started yet. So this was as far north as they came. So the Pope wrote back to the bishop and he said, no, sorry, you don't need any more money. Your building's big enough, thank you very much. So after this accidental fire, the Pope and the King granted as many trees as they needed to use to repair the cathedral from the fire. With that, they took a little bit of artistic license and they made the building ever so slightly bigger. It got a little bit longer, and that's also when they added the chapter house on the side, the wee octagonal bit on the outside, the bit that's still got its roof. That's when they added that. Then business carried on as usual once the additions and the repairs were completed. And then in 1390, a spoiled brat by the name of Alexander Stuart, you know him in history as the Wolf of Badenoch. He had a turbulent marriage. He was married off to a lady who had lots of money, and he wasted it. They married him off to this lady because he was somebody who liked to gamble. He liked to spend. He liked to throw his money away. So they married him off to a rich lady. After 7 years, they hadn't been able to produce a child. And he got frustrated with this. And he had a few affairs, shall we say. He had a few extra girlfriends on the side. When the bishop found out about this, you see, at this time, Alexander was working for the bishop. Him and his men were basically patrolling what is now the Moray area, making sure that the parishioners of the cathedral and the smaller churches in the area didn't get robbed, raided, or murdered on their way to and from the church. He was also charged with protecting the churches and the cathedral in the area from being robbed and raided. Well, he went to the bishop one day and he's, look, sorry, boss, I need a pay rise. What do you need a pay rise for? Oh, my girlfriend's pregnant. And what about your wife? You see, at this point, we're in the 1300s. It's really, really not allowed to have a girlfriend when you're married, even today. So the bishop said to Alexander Stuart, he's like, look, mate, you have to go back to your wife. You can't have a girlfriend. And because you work for the church, you have to stick by the church's rules. So he didn't like this. And he complained. So the bishop says to him, he says, okay, look, I'll give you 3 weeks to sort yourself out, but you have to go back to your wife, and there's no ifs or buts about it. So 3 weeks later, he's called into the bishop's office. And the bishop says to him, so, how's the wife? Oh, I don't know, I haven't seen her. Okay, so you're still with your girlfriend? Yes. Well, you do realise that means I have to fire you. No, please, please, please. So he begged and pleaded to keep his job. But the bishop was having none of it because this was completely against the church's rules. So the bishop fired him. And during the argy-bargy that broke out, because he really was a petulant, noisy, mouthy person, was Alexander. He kept going on and on and on at the bishop. And in the finish-up, he got angry, did Alexander, and he punched the bishop. That got him excommunicated. Now, when you're excommunicated in the 1300s, you're not allowed to set foot in any church in the world. And when you die, you have a one-way ticket to hell. This is how they thought in the 1300s. The church was everything. There's no police force. There's only the church. So the other bad thing about being excommunicated is you couldn't say hello to normal people. If you were seen so much as waving at someone over the street who's normal and not being excommunicated, you could be whipped on the spot. Because when you're excommunicated, you're only allowed to speak to beggars, thieves, and animals. So if you got excommunicated and your brother or your sister or your best friend wasn't, you weren't allowed to talk to them again. If you were seen talking to them, you'd be punished, which usually meant you were getting whipped. So it's not fun. So Alexander realized this was going to be his life now. Nobody was allowed to speak to him. So he went over to see his brother, who was the Earl of Moray, who lived in Darnaway Castle over beside Forres. And his brother says to him, he says, look, mate, he says, you can't be here. He's like, how no? I'm your brother. Yeah, you're my brother, but I have a tournament this weekend. I have lords and ladies from all over Scotland coming to this castle. And because of the rules of excommunication, you are not allowed to be here. You have to go. So Alexander wasn't very happy and he left. He went down to what is now Forres High Street and found himself a wee pub. And he's drowning his sorrows. And these two local lads who were, shall we say, a little bit rough. They were known to be thieves, which is why nobody else would drink with them. So they went over to join Alexander because they noticed how much money he was putting over the bar. No worries, Bronwyn. Noticed how much money he was putting over the bar, so they're like, here, we need to make friends with this guy. He's rich, obviously, because the amount he's spending. So they go down and sit with him, and they get him a drink, and he tells them his story, what's happened to him. And they're like, oh, you need to get your own back on this bishop. And Alexander's like, yeah? How? Rob him. Oh, great, yeah. Have you seen how many people work in that cathedral? I'm just going to saunter in the front door and rob the bishop? I don't think so. And then somebody else says, rob his house. And he's like, again, he has a big household staff. There's no chance. So they had a few more drams, and then one of them says, I know. What? If you destroy his property, he has to pay to get it repaired. So Alexander's like, yeah, and what are you thinking? Well, you could burn his house down. And then Alexander realises, well, we could burn a lot of things that belong to the bishop. Now, during the distancing from Alexander's wife, Euphemia, the bishop had also been protecting her, aided by Dunbar, who was another local earl. Now, Dunbar had properties in Forest High Street, or what was then something other than Forest High Street, but now it's Forest High Street. He had properties on that street, did Dunbar. So Alexander says to the boys, he's like, have you got some friends that can come and help us? Aye, sure, we know plenty. So they went and they gathered a few folks together. From what I can remember, I believe it was only something like 15 to 20 men altogether. And they set light to all of Dunbar's property in Forest High Street. They then rode on to Kinloss Abbey, burned it down. Then they went on to Pluscarden Abbey, burned it as well. When they came into Elgin, they burned half of the high street. That section of open fields from the 8 Acres Hotel down to the end beside Sheriff Mill, that empty fields used to be Cheapside. Yes, I know it's on the West End, which says technically it should be the money side, but it wasn't. It is now, but it wasn't originally. They burned that half. They burned more than that half in the high street, actually, but the people who lived in Cheapside couldn't afford to rebuild their houses, which is why today it is empty fields. So then they got into what is now Cooper Park, and they burned 18 of the 19 manses that were in Cooper Park. The wee one that still stands over the road from the cathedral, the wee empty tower house, that's the only one that survived. That's the precentor's manse. We can talk about that one another day. Then they went into the cathedral. Of course, there's a lot of chaos going on. All the staff are running out of the cathedral. Everybody's running around, trying to get away from the flames. These men come bursting into the cathedral, fill their pockets with what gold and silver they can find, and then set fire to everything. Now, if you've only seen the cathedral as it stands today, you're sitting there wondering, how do you set fire to stone? All the way around the interior of the church, up to about 2 meters high, minimum, there would have been wooden paneling on the inside of the stone. Number one, for warmth. Number two, for decoration. On these wooden panels, they would have painted biblical scenes using the old medieval paints, which, chemistry lesson coming up, contains a lot of heavy metals, which are highly explosive when exposed to certain temperatures and certain substances. We know some of the stone, geology lesson coming up, is yellow sandstone. To turn yellow sandstone to the lovely reds that you see on the inside of Elgin Cathedral requires 200 degrees Celsius. So Alexander's fire at the cathedral wasn't a little one. It was a dirty, great, huge one. Did an awful lot of damage. All the wooden interior was pretty much trashed. Excuse me. As they're moving through the building, in the chapter house, which of course is the only fully enclosed space, the heat from the fire actually twisted the stone window frames. It was a massive fire. The building was completely gutted out. Thankfully, a lot of the sandstone survived. A lot of the building survived that fire, actually. It's just all the wooden interior that was trashed. And they repaired, and they extended, and they added a massive big tower in the middle of the cathedral. As you look at any cathedral anywhere, most of the old-fashioned medieval ones are built in the shape of a cross. So they're built as a cross. Okay, Elgin Cathedral, you've got the chapter house coming off of the edge of the cross, but they're built as a cross. Now, where the two corridors, for want of a better way to explain it, cross, is called the crossing. Nice and simple. Above the crossing, after this fire, they added another tower. You see, the reason the church kept adding and repairing after each of these fires was their own way of going, nah, 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 nah. And that's precisely why they did it. The tower that they added after the Wolf's Fire was over 70 meters tall. The two towers that you can see there now are only 30 meters tall. The one they added was over 70. So that was a massive... So, but it was too ambitious. It was too big. It weighed too much for the building. It started to kind of make the roof go a little bit saggy. So they had to extend the sides of the cathedral to spread the weight. Here's a wee engineering lesson. When you've got all that weight sitting in the middle, if it's on a wee thing like that, it's going to collapse. If you make the thing that's holding it up bigger, wider, it will support the weight better. So that's what they did. They made the sides of the church a little bit wider to spread the weight out. Over 100 years they worked on this tower, and it still wasn't completely finished. In 1402 is when they had their third fire. You see, the Diocese of Moray back then went from Buckie all the way over to the Isle of Skye. We were also in charge of the southern half of Caithness. So that's a huge area of land. Every church within that area was sending money to Elgin Cathedral as part of this is how the church runs. So this is how the cathedral ended up being, even to this day, the second biggest one in Scotland. But MacDonald, the King of Orkney and Shetland, he owned the northern half of Caithness, and he wanted the southern half to complete the set. So he wrote to the bishop, and he's like, look, I want to make you an offer for that land. And of course, if the bishop gives up that section of land, he's giving up quite a bit of money. So the bishop writes back, and he's like, I'm really sorry, but it's not for sale. So King MacDonald writes back, and he's like, let me come down and visit you. We'll make you an offer you can't refuse. So the bishop, who was very, very proud of his cathedral, very, very proud of the city of Elgin, he wrote back, and he's like, yeah, sure, come see us. I'll give you a tour. I'll show you the sights. So MacDonald actually sent his son, because he wasn't really fit to travel. He was an old man. So his son turned up with 300 soldiers. Yeah, you can pretty much guess what's coming, can't you? So MacDonald and his 300 soldiers were given a tour of the cathedral chanonry, the cathedral precinct. Basically, if you imagine the walls around your garden, or the fence around your garden, marking out the property that belongs to your house. So now expand it. So instead of your house, it's the cathedral. And we're going to look at the walls that would have been around the cathedral precinct, which is basically a gigantic extended garden. Now, if you're local, you'll know exactly the places I mean. So we're going to start at Decora, the DIY store. There's one corner of the cathedral precinct wall. Then if you take that down through Cooper Park, out the back of the osteopaths, you know, the big house with the big fancy gateway beside the cathedral, out the back of that house, all the way down onto Pansport Road. Then go from that section of Pansport Road in Kings Mills down to the Pansport Road at the roundabout. Then going from the roundabout up to Elgin Museum, and then from Elgin Museum back to Decorah. That's the land that was immediately owned by the cathedral. That's the bit that was controlled. You couldn't build a house, grow anything in that spaces without having permission from the church. You can still see sections of the original wall, the Pansport archway for one. Oh yeah, absolutely. The Pansport archway for one is original, and it has some of the original walls still attached to it. And there's a wee side street that runs up towards King Street. I've forgotten the name of it, but it's literally at the side of the cathedral, and there's a wee section where the houses are kind of set back from the side of the road because there's a massive chunk of wall right next to the road. That's part of the original cathedral wall as well. So these 300 soldiers and the King of Orkney and Shetland were given this tour around the cathedral precinct. And as they're going round, the soldiers are making a shopping list. 2-metre high gold cross, that's about £3,000. Oh, there's a 4-metre one there, that'll be about 10 grand. And so on and so on. They're making this shopping list as they're going round. Once they've had their tour, MacDonald and the bishop go up to the town centre for lunch. While they're having their lunch, there's a wee lad comes running in. He's like, excuse me, what's wrong? The cathedral's on fire. Oops. What these 300 soldiers had done when they stayed in the precinct is they gathered pots and tubs, because of course it's all going to be pottery or metal, isn't it? They put tinder stuff in the bottom, so straw, hay, dry twigs, anything that'll burn. And then over the top, they put a covering of wet leaves. So very small fires create a huge amount of smoke. And they put one of these pots or tubs in every single doorway of the cathedral. So Elgin Cathedral filled with smoke. Now this is only 12 years after the Wolf's Fire. So everybody panicked. Everybody ran away. Nobody's actually recorded as being hurt during this, by the way. Everybody panicked and ran away because it wasn't very long after the big fire. Once the staff had all panicked and ran away, the 300 soldiers went inside and stole everything. All the gold, all the silver, they stole it all and legged it straight back to Orkney. Now later on, when news of this reached the king, he wrote to the King of Orkney. So the King of Scotland writes to the King of Orkney and he's like, look mate, you've got to give that stuff back. You've got to give the money back. Oh no, we can't do that. We spent half of it just getting back to Orkney. Well, yeah, I suppose travel and transport for 301 people is quite expensive. It's not like they could have driven there, you know. So the King of Scotland puts this message onto the bishop. And the bishop writes back and he's like, he has to do an act of penance then. Like a way of saying sorry. We can't put him on the naughty step because that wouldn't work. So they're going to fine him. So like, if you mess up during this time that everybody's home, if you mess up, you might find that your isolation to the house becomes isolation to your room only, or isolation to the airing cupboard or the shoe cupboard. So they couldn't really do that because he's king. So it's like, okay, instead of doing that, we're going to confiscate some of his pocket money, which is how we would do it to you guys. So the king comes up with a plan. So he comes back and he goes, writes to the king of Orkney. He's like, right, okay, seeing as you don't have the money to give back, what we want you to do is we want you to build something that's going to be a big gesture to show I'm a bad man, I stole from the church, and this is me saying sorry to everybody. And it has to be something that is equivalent to the missing £15,000. Now, this is £15,000 in 1402. In today's money, you can add 2 or 3 zeros on the end of it, at least. So he agrees. He's like, yes, he says, I will put up a statue, a sculpture, something like that, that will be my apology and it will cover the missing money. Yeah, okay. So he organised this. Now, if you've ever been past Elgin Museum, you'll see outside there's a big pole. There's like 5 steps with a big pole on the top. On the very top of it, there's a little square block with pieces of metal sticking out of it, which is actually supposed to be a sundial, but it doesn't actually work. It's not in the right position. And on the very, very top of it, there's a little iron cross. That is the thing that the King of Orkney actually paid for to be built. That is his big, grand apology that's supposed to represent such a huge amount of money. I don't think it would have represented even 10% of the money that he stole from Elgin Cathedral, but never mind. So the cathedral repaired the damage from this third fire. We didn't get any bigger at that point. We didn't need to. We were still working on trying to make that big tower stay up. So they carried on as normal until 1560, when the Reformation closed us down. Now, the Reformation that closed us down is nothing to do with Henry VIII. At that point in history, when Henry was throwing his tantrums, Scotland and England didn't speak. Henry never came any further north than Yorkshire, so it's nothing to do with Henry. Ours was the Covenanters, and the Covenanters is a really overly involved topic that can be quite difficult to get a hold of, so I'm going to break it right the way down to bare bones. So, the people of Elgin, the people of Moray, didn't speak English in the 1500s. The only ones who could speak English were the rich people. The rest of us spoke a strange local dialect that was kind of a blend of the Doric that you hear now and Gaelic. Excuse me. No, I've nae got it. It's a smoker's cough. And they had this guy, this bishop, wearing clothes that are woven with gold and silver. Aye, real gold and silver threads. And he's preaching at them every Sunday. And none of the locals understand a word the dude's saying. But when he's not stood preaching at them, he speaks their own language. And he's like, look, I'm just one of you guys. I just have a better job. So eventually, the normal people and some of the lower ranking nobles turned around and said, okay, if you're one of us, how's about sharing that pay packet? And that's the bare bones version of the Covenanters. And this became a nationwide thing throughout all of Scotland. The churchmen could still preach, but they were requested to preach in a language that the locals where they were understood. They had to get rid of all the gold and silver that they were hoarding for themselves, both the clothing, the big fancy hat, and the big gold bo-peep walking stick. Had to get rid of all of that and get rid of all the pomp and ceremony, is one way that some folk have worded it. So at Elgin Cathedral, we gave away all the gold and silver that they had. They gave it to the other smaller churches in and around the Elgin area. Once all the goodies and all the money was divided between all the other churches, anything that would have normally taken place at the cathedral, like Easter, Christmas, things like that, was moved to the St. Giles Church in the middle of the high street. It wasn't that particular version of it, but there's another lesson we can do another time. So all the services were moved to St. Giles Church. All the gold and silver was divided. If you've ever been to Pluscarden Abbey, if you see that amazing, massive, it's like over 2 meters, carved wooden lectern with the eagle on it, and there's some cherubs and things, and there's vines round the bottom, that massive lectern is actually from the cathedral. The smaller gold, well, it's actually gold-plated lectern that they sometimes use in St. Sylvester's Church is also from the cathedral. So there are still traces of the stuff dotted around in different churches if you know what you're looking for. And then once all that was given up, they locked the doors and they walked away, left the building as it was, empty. It stood for a while. Then about 40 years later, there was an envoy from mainland Europe came over. They were in need of metal. All the little countries in Europe were all fighting with each other. This would later on become the Napoleonic Wars, but at this stage it's just little border fights, right? So they needed metal for ammunition. So the Privy Council, which is the council in charge of the churches, got together and they're like, well, Elgin Cathedral, the roof is lead. There's 3 massive bells in there too. So the roof was dismantled and sold to Europe along with the bells. Also the roof and the bells of St. Macher's Cathedral in Aberdeen and another smaller church. These were all sold to the Europeans that came over. All of it was horse and carted piece by piece down to Aberdeen Harbour and loaded onto the ship to go off to mainland Europe. Once it's all loaded, everything seems hunky-dory, so they set sail. About 20 minutes after leaving their berth in Aberdeen Harbour, the ship sank under the weight. The roofs and the bells of 3 different churches was way too much for the single wooden ship to carry. So, where's the roof and the bells of Elgin Cathedral? Just outside Aberdeen Harbour somewhere. Although I should imagine some of the local folk down there have salvaged them long ago. But that leaves the cathedral roofless, open to the elements, but still complete. Then, fast forward another 20 years, and a bad storm demolishes one part of the rafters set up. The King's Mill side, or the Johnston's Woolen Mill side, where the eye is, the eye window, the circular window. The rafters at that section collapsed in a storm. Then, 150 years after that, we get to 1711. In 1711, we had an extremely bad storm in Elgin. It didn't just hit Elgin, it hit all of this area. Some books describe it as a week of gales. Some say it was a tornado. One, I found an extract from someone's diary where they had an anemometer, you know, the wind speed measure things, the wee cups that spin with the wind. They had one of them set up on Lady Hill that they used to measure the wind speed locally. They went up to get it the day after the storm passed through Elgin, and the anemometer was completely gone. No trace of it. It was a horrendous storm. It's difficult to imagine, but we're looking at hurricane scale winds for that storm. Maison Dieu Hospital, which, surprise, surprise, stood at the end of Maison Dieu Road, where they've put that big salt grit dome thing. That's pretty much where Maison Dieu Hospital was. The hospital was demolished with that storm. It was reduced from a two-story building, two-story building, down to a knee-high pile of rubble by the winds that came. The cathedral, its big tower that was never fully completed because it was too big, the winds came around that, gave it a nice big tight hug, and then the tower collapsed. Over 70 metres high, or 198 feet for those of us who use old money. When it collapsed, it fell through towards the biblical garden, which is why when you look at the cathedral today, the side that faces Anderson's nursing home has like window traceries and things like that. But on the side that faces the biblical garden, there's practically nothing. That's why the tower fell through that wall and took most of the building with it. That is why Elgin Cathedral is ruined, not because of what the wolf did. The tower didn't collapse until nearly, just short of, I've got to work it out. I've got to use my calculator. My maths ain't that good. So the tower collapsed in 1711, and the Wolf of Badenoch's fire was in 1390. So that's 321 years. So the next time somebody tells you the Wolf of Badenoch destroyed Elgin Cathedral, tell them they're wrong, because it stood for another 321 years after his fire. And so the cathedral's in ruins, the big tower's collapsed. The local folk come and pinch the stone, because the building wasn't being used anyway. The really, really odd thing about it is the cathedral was already shut down because of the Reformation, right? So your Easter services and things like that would have been taking place in the St. Giles Church, which is very, very fortuitous, very, very lucky, because the day that the storm took down the tower of Elgin Cathedral was Easter Sunday. So if the cathedral had still been getting used at that point, there would be nobody here now, because everybody would have been expected to be inside the church on Easter Sunday, storm or no storm. So we're quite lucky that it wasn't being used when it collapsed. Folk took the stone to build their own houses, to add fancy decorative details to their houses. Some of the bits you can see around town, if you know Boots Pharmacy on the High Street, the wee close that goes up the right-hand side of it, where the little lunchbox and such like are. If you got that close, you'll see one of the bishops is peering at you out of the wall. Sometimes the locals put a cigarette in his mouth, which is not recommended practice, but hey-ho. There are also some mantelpiece stones from the big house that stood where Boots is now. One of the other bits and pieces from the cathedral is If you go up towards the A96 entrance to Dr. Gray's Hospital, all the bonny hooses on the right-hand side as you're facing Inverness, they've got some amazing stonework in their walls, whether it be the house wall or the garden wall. There's some other bits up the Lido Close. You'll see a rather fancy honeycombed, it's almost an egg shape, but what it is, it's pieces from the top of the arch, from the belfries, from the top floors of the cathedral is what that is. But it looks like some odd kind of honeycomb thing. Where else have we got? The original gates were even taken. And the original cathedral gates, the last record I can find of them is they were gifted to somebody who lived in Rose Avenue, which is now down the side of Murray College car park. They were gifted to somebody in a house there in 1942. I don't know why, I don't know who it was that was claiming ownership, but it was recorded as being gifted to one of the houses in Rose Avenue. The original doors were also taken. Big, heavy, solid wooden oak doors. You can be sure they were taken and made use of. There's bits and pieces of Elgin Cathedral all over Elgin, really. So if you see a fancy bit of stone that's got a pattern carved into it and it doesn't really fit with the rest of the building or the rest of that street, take a photo, upload it onto this thread here, and I'll tell you if it's one of the cathedral bits or if it's a bit from another building that I know. Because there are bits of the cathedral all over Elgin. After that, of course, we became the quarry for nearly 100 years. And then you have the first keepers of the cathedral. The very, very first one was Saunders Cook. I know some of you are sitting there going, no, he's not, no, minute. But he is. Saunders Cook was a retired alcoholic. Well, he wasn't a retired alcoholic. He was a retired shoemaker. He was an alcoholic. He had the job for about 3 months. He would sit in the front of the cathedral. Oh, you want to see the building? Aye, on you go, son, help yourself. And he'd just sit there and get drunk. One of his friends, a younger man by the name of John Shanks, is the one that most of you will know of. He was also a retired shoemaker. He was also an alcoholic. So history over the century and a bit between then and now has blended the two men together to make one. The Druithi Cobbler pub is named after John Shanks. Druithi, if you look in an English Scotch, sorry, trying the teeth out for the dog. If you look in an English to Scots dictionary, it will tell you Druithi means thirsty. It actually means alcoholic. So both men were heavy drinkers, both men were retired shoemakers, so it's understandable that history blended the two together to make one. John Shanks was the first one to live in the wee house at the front of the cathedral, which is now the shop. And he's the first one who actually bothered to do anything. One night he was sitting in the house getting drunk with his missus, and they had a big argument. And she told him to get off his bum and go and do something instead of getting under her feet, drunk and incapable. So he went outside with a wheelbarrow and a pick and a shovel and started clearing the rubbish and the rubble. Because in the 100 years that it had been used as a quarry, people were throwing their rubbish in there. So it was kind of the quarry / town tip. So he started getting rid of all the rubbish and the rubble, clearing the place up, making it look nice. When he'd finished with that, sorry, I should have made myself a coffee. When he'd finished with that, he started exploring the loose ground round about in certain places, and he uncovered bits and pieces of the cathedral. When John Shanks started working there, see that massive double-arched doorway at the front of the cathedral? When he started, you would have to duck to go through that doorway. The ground level inside the cathedral was the same as the street at the front when he started work. He cleared all the rubbish and the rubble. He uncovered a lot of the gravestones, uncovered a lot of the fancy details at the base of some of the walls. He even found keys for the old doors, which are in the museum in the High Street. One of which is actually very, very close to one of the keys that they use at the cathedral today. As he found a pretty piece of stonework, he would just stand it up against the wall where he found it, because he didn't have a clue what he was doing. He wasn't an archaeologist. He knew nothing about the church as such. He just knew that's pretty, let's stand it up so folk can see it. Now, at the time he's doing this, you've still got people coming and pinching bits of the cathedral too. There's actually a very famous painting where he stood in front of the towers doing a tour for two men in top hat and tails. And off to the left side, there's four men loading a massive chunk of stone onto a horse and cart so they can take it off for theirs. John Shanks is the only man buried in Elgin Cathedral that has two stones. He has his actual burial stone, and then there is the white one that's been put up beside the fence to tell people his story. So he's the only man in there with two stones. Quick bits on the cemetery just to fill the last 15 minutes because I wanted to make it an hour. So, in the cemetery, you have a very large gravestone that looks like the gable end of a house with the chimney. That one was sketched by Charles Rennie Mackintosh when he was a student, before he was famous. On that stone, there are crossed bones in little rectangular boxes. And it's a repeat pattern all the way across the full width of that gravestone. Every time I see it, I can't help but wonder, was this the inspiration for some of his geometry type artwork that he did? Next to that, there are two New Orleans style box graves where it looks like just like the box sitting on the top. That's Patrick Sellers and his family. He's the man responsible for the Highland clearances. Yes, he was a local man to Elgin. We can cover him in another lesson another day. Coming down around the back of the chapter house, there are two mort safes. Now, mort safe is Latin, and it literally translates as protecting the dead. What it is, one of them is a gravestone with a little fence around it to stop you being dug up and sold to the doctors. Next to it, there's one that has a massive big iron railing, big enclosure all the way around it. That family were a family of ironmongers. So their mort safe is also an advert to try and bring their family some business. Coming around the back and up the other side, so beside the King Street side, you have John Shanks Memorial Remembrance Stone. And then next to that, you have the back of family enclosures. Now, you can't see inside from street level, but the first family enclosure is Dr. Gray's family, as in Dr. Gray's Hospital. Coming further up, you get to the section that has a roof, what they call the Gordon Aisle at the cathedral. There's a little section with a roof. At the very, very end of that roof, where that bit finishes before you get to the no wall section, bolted on to the external wall that's holding the roof up is one of the tallest gravestones in Scotland. It's over 5 metres high. It covers 200 years of the Anderson family, not General Anderson. It's different Andersons. Covers 200 years of the Anderson family, and there are 27 names on it. And when they ran out of room on the big stone, there is a little pauper stone at the bottom of it, which is just about the size of my phone, and all you can see on it is Anderson. And there is an overview of Elgin Cathedral. Vagaries in the graves. There are 1,736 readable gravestones in the cemetery. There are lots that are missing because they've been broken over the centuries. There are about 200 that are in storage because they need some work done on them, but they're too dangerous to be on the site in case they fall on someone. So those 200 are squirreled away in a warehouse being worked on until they can be fixed and put them back where they're supposed to be. Any questions or comments, either from yourselves or for the kids, feel free to comment on the bottom here. If you do go around the town taking photos of different bits and pieces, again, stick to the social distancing, be safe, and don't forget to upload your pictures on here, and I'll tell you if it's a bit of the cathedral or a bit of another building. Until then, I will see you later. Be good, be safe, and I'll see you when all this palaver's finished with. Bye.